Now, at this point, if you notice, the borders are kind of cut out sharply. And most of the times we want to have kind of straight borders to make sure it's easier to integrate or connect with neighboring pieces of terrain. So let's see how we can deal with these borders. The first process I'm thinking is that we could use just an automatic system that's going to take into account the size of the terrain and automatically adapt to it. Let's say we'll use a sphere, and I'm gonna let's grab the original height field we have here, the plain height field. It already has the proper dimensions. And we'll do height field mask by object. So this will be the height field that we want to practice with this one. And this will be the object. Now the size of the object is going to take into account, again, the same, the height field as well. Or we can just grab the expressions that we're using here, Control C, and we can place them here on the sphere. So the radius in X is going to be that, and Y, well, it's going to be that, but let's say I'm going to leave it as the X size as well. So the height field, the Y axis is not going to have a lot. Yeah, but let's give it the Z axis, the proper axis. So let's see what that gives us. So Y, and on the next one, it's the Z. Now this gives us this sphere, and that's perfectly fine. We could connect this here and see what that gives us. Now the size doesn't take into account the fact that the sphere uses a radius. The radius is half of it's not properly the diameter, so we need to divide these by 2. So let's say divide by 2. On the y-axis, I'm going to leave it. The y-axis isn't really all that relevant. And the z-axis, I'll divide it by 2. So now we have a sphere that's perfectly matching the dimensions of our square, perfectly included on the square of our terrain. But we want to want to go a bit further in. So what we can do is just divide this, let's say 2.5, and here 2.5. It's nice. Now we have this height field mask, and we can use a height field blur, mask blur. Let's blur this a good amount, 100, maybe 200. Seems good. And after that, it would make sense that the radius would be kind of proportional to the size. So what we could do is, again, base the same expression. This is going to give us the size, and we're going to divide this by 10, something like that. And this gives us 314. It's fine. That way, if the size changes, then this is going to be proportional. And once we have this, then what we could do is kind of combine this terrain that we have here with the plane terrain based on this mask. So let's see how we can do that. So height field layer, and we'll combine the terrain with the planar one based on this mask. It's actually the reverse that we want. We can just invert the mask. And as you can see, now we have kind of a straight borders, and we have the piece of our terrain just in the middle. So this is the automatic approach, and maybe we can definitely fine tune this. Maybe the mask blur is a bit too strong. Maybe 10 isn't enough. Maybe 20 would be better. So it's a bit sharper. Maybe 15. It's a good compromise, I think. And if you want to, we can expand the sphere as well. Same thing. Instead of dividing by 2.5, we can go a bit lower, maybe 2.4. 2.4. 2.4 isn't much of a difference, so maybe 2.2. And here the same thing, maybe 2.2. And that way we're grabbing a bit more of a sharp transition there. 2.2 might be too little, maybe 2.3. It's a matter of personal preference. Might be a good idea to expose this parameter and have it available for us to easily change this, but I think this is a good compromise. Considering this is an automatic solution where we don't really need to do anything at all, it's going to automatically focus on the center and have a smooth transition to the borders. This is the automatic version. Now, the other option would be for us to actually use, instead of use mask by object based on an automatic sphere generated based on the size of the terrain, we can actually use a curve to create a mask for this. Let's see how we can do that. So let's have a look at the terrain that we want. The idea behind using a curve would be to looking at the terrain. Let me put this in top view, spacebar 2, and I'll start creating a curve. I'll keep this visible and I'll hit enter. And with this curve on, I'm gonna build a curve grabbing the area that I'm interested in. Well, let's say it's not perfectly, so instead of having a perfectly circular selection, I can, for instance, grab something like this. Enter, close it, and we can use this same way as we did here. Let's pull this to the side. Now let's use this curve. Same thing, height field mask object. I'll use exactly the same input, but instead I'm going to be using now this. So this gives me, this corresponds to the selection that I made with this curve. It's kind of a sharp curve. We can always kind of resample the curve we draw. Okay, so now we're back. This is, I managed to interrupt the calculation and put the resample with a length of 10, which is still quite a bit. Let's say 20, maybe even more, 50. Sounds good. And then you can just switch from treat polygons as straight edges and switch to subdivision edges. And this is much softer. And this gives us this nice mask. And after that, you can just go through the same process. Let's go with the height field blur. Apply the same strategy. So I have this blur, and we would use this mask instead. And this would give us this selection. Let's go to perspective, and as you can see, it's better. Of course, we can grab more of an organic shape out of the cut it manually out of the original terrain, comparing with this selection, which is kind of random. This is a better one, but we can keep both options available. Let's use a switch here, and if we're going to use a switch, we actually just need one of these. Let's put it here, this here, and let's say that the first option is going to be the automatic one, and we might want to activate the option that takes into account a curve that we draw to create this effect. It's going to be the curve. Let's make it more visible that this is something that we want to input. So I'll press C and I'll select the color, say pink color. So this is something that we have to manually address. Everything else is pretty much automatic. And with the switch node, we can quickly select between one and the other. And as you can probably guess, we'll include this control on our HDA. So now that we have the borders taken care of, there's just one more thing we need to do to make sure that everything is updated. I'm going to create a height field visualize so you can understand what I mean. So right now, this is not affecting our trees layer. Let's have a look at our trees layer. I'm going to just remove all of these, and let's get our trees, and let's put it in green, and maybe switch this color to black or something like that. Now, as you can see, the areas that have been flattened out by the previous operation isn't affecting the trees layer. And for us to have that, we just need to make sure that the layer, the height field that's coming in on input 2, okay, on the second input, um, that layer actually has some trees information that we can blend. Right now, if I hold Control and middle mouse button, you'll see we only have height and mask, while the other, the first input will have height, mask, and trees. Now, the height field layer is by default combining all layers, which is fine. We just need to make sure that this input also includes a trees layer. And for that, we just create a height field copy. And we know that our mask information, for instance, is at 0. So we want the borders to, the tree layer at the borders to be at 0 as well. So we can just copy the source mask to trees, which is basically just creating an empty, a layer at 0 with a 0 value all over. And now we're combining both input trees, the trees coming from this with the trees coming from that, and that gives us the result that we wanted. So the properly updated trees layer as well. Okay, and that finishes up this section of dealing with the borders, and let's move on to the next lesson.